So I'll ask you to all mute yourselves over the course of the reading and stuff, just to keep it quiet and nice for our panelists of Frances and Scott. All right. We can probably get started here. Looks like a nice crowd. Fantastic. All right, Caroline, I'm going to go for it now. All right, welcome everybody. My name is Matt Bowes, and I'm the General Manager of New West Press, publishers of Frances Peck's new book, Uncontrolled Flight. Thank you very much for coming to our launch/discussion event today. And hopefully you got some nice weather wherever you are. I am coming to you from Edmonton, Alberta, and myself and New West Press would wish to acknowledge that the land on which we operate is Treaty 6 territory and a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous people, including Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, and Nakota Sioux. But I'm not the reason why you're here. The reason you're here is to meet Frances Peck and Scott Ludlow, who are our two panelists, talkers today. But before we get started with them, I'd like to point your attention towards our chat, where Tamara from Western Sky Books has put some links where you can get your own copies of Uncontrolled Flight. So there's a link to the Canadian Independent Bookstore Association, where you can order a copy in your town. But if you're in Vancouver, order it straight from the source at Western Sky. That's the second link there. So we'd like to say thanks to Western Sky for helping us out with this event and for just generally being a good bookstore. But I'm going to introduce our panelists today. So first up, we've got Frances Peck. Frances has been steadily making her way across Canada. She grew up in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, spent decades in Ottawa, Ontario, and now lives in North Vancouver, BC. During her editor days, she was an editor, ghostwriter, and educator, and she wrote a book called Peck's English Pointers, co-wrote the Hypergrammar website, and taught workshops in editing in plain language across the country. But now she's returned to her first love, writing fiction. Her first novel, which came out with New West Press, is called The Broken Places. It earned glowing reviews and a wide readership. It's a Globe and Mail Best Book of 2022 and a finalist for the Rakuten Kobo Emerging Writer Prize. And tonight we're going to be talking about Uncontrolled Flight, her second novel, which blends literary styling with page-turning story. So welcome to the stage, Frances Peck. Hello. And also joining us today is Scott Ludlow. So they're going to get into what Uncontrolled Flight is about, but there's a strand in the story about a sort of plane crash investigation, and that's where Scott's coming from. So pilot and former investigator, Scott flew professionally for 15 years, was active in almost every subpart of Canadian aviation, from airline to medevac to complex aerial work and flight instruction, before transitioning to aviation accident investigation. Academically, Scott has a master's degree in aeronautics, specializing in aviation system safety. It's tough to say. Originally from the East Coast as well, Scott now lives in the Vancouver area and remains working in aviation safety. So welcome, Scott. There he is. So I think I will hand the mic over to Frances, who's going to talk a little bit about the book. So thanks, everyone. Frances, go for it.
Matt, thank you so much. Huge thanks to everybody at New West Press for making this day possible. I know a lot of you who are here for the online launch, and I know that you know how long and hard I worked to get published. So it's a real honor to be published not only once, but twice by this fine press. Thanks for all that you do, not just for me, but for Canadian writers in general. And by the way, New West Press is up for Publisher of the Year at the Book Publisher Association of Alberta Awards, coming up in, about 10 days or something like that. So fingers crossed, yeah, that this is the year. So I'm going to say just a few words about the book and then read from the book, right, Matt? I think I'll go right into that. And afterwards, Scott and I and Matt are going to have some discussions. We'll see where they lead us. And we're going to be sure to leave lots of time for audience question and answer at the end as well. And Matt, did you want to say anything about that before I get reading?
Sure. So we're going to be probably doing 10 minutes of reading, 20 minutes, 30 minutes of you two talking and me kind of seeding some questions. And then at the end, we're going to have a Q&A session. And for the Q&A session, I will ask you to put those questions in the chat. So at the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says chat. You can type your message in there and Carolina will relay it to me, just so that we're not having to get everyone to unmute themselves and go on camera. It's just easier to do it this way. So I'll relay your questions to our panel of guests. So this is the easiest way to do it. And just another reminder, we're being recorded for YouTube. So it's another reason why we're just trying to keep it as clean and simple as possible. So that'll be the procedure. And I'll remind you again when we're getting into the Q&A session. But yeah, there we go.
Great. I think that my camera already froze. It has a way of doing that only when I'm on it, which is always a pain. So if for any reason I am freezing while this is going on, I hope someone's going to shout in my ear that that's the case. Okay, so we are going to kick things off with a reading just to bring you into the world of uncontrolled flight before we get into conversation. This is the book right here. And I'm going to, in honor of who our special guest is, Scott being a former air accident investigator, I'm going to read from the beginning of chapter 2 of the novel, because this is the chapter that introduces us to Natalie. She's one of the 3, maybe 4 main characters of the novel, and she is an accident investigator with the Transportation Safety Board. This is the chapter where we meet Natalie for the first time, so I don't think that it really requires any setup. Media training. Natalie slammed a stack of files onto her desk. Fuck that noise, I'm not going. Look at all the records I've got to go through. Plus, I'm waiting to hear from the coroner. He promised me the preliminary report from the pathologist this afternoon. And the GPS analysis that could come in anytime. I'm not wasting an afternoon in the boardroom listening to some suited up sleazebag tell us how to dodge reporters' questions and look the public in the eye while telling them fuck all. Nonetheless, methinks you must go. Lyndon leaned against the flimsy, fabric-covered divider that passed for an office wall in the space and cash-strapped world of the Canadian government. He peered down at his petite colleague, nearly a foot shorter, even in high-heeled boots. It's part of the regional training plan. We have to go. You know that. And you know I've got a rich helicopter pilot and his new wife dead, journalists crawling up my ass, family members to meet next week, and no clue what happened. I don't give a flying fuck about the regional training plan. Why doesn't Mr. Hugo Boss from Ottawa make himself useful and go deal with the media for us? That'd be a lot better use of the taxpayers' money than another PowerPoint nap in the boardroom. Natalie Girard, the people's watchdog. Lyndon smirked. Not a single one of us wants to go to this. But if you play truant, Tucker will march over here and haul you in and make a spectacle of it too. You know how he is. Tucker the fucker, then I won't be here to haul. Natalie gathered up the files and slung her laptop case over her shoulder. You do not know where I am. Fine. But this I do know, shit shall come your way if you are not in that boardroom. If not from Tucker, then from head office. Natalie tossed her dark curls. Oh, spare me. Head office is too busy writing pointless emails and organizing retirement dinners to pay attention to what we actually do out in the regions. She grabbed her keys. I've got my cell. You can always call if anything important comes up. Have it your way, mamselle. Lyndon gave her a shallow bow before sauntering off, his mannerisms, like his speech, accented by his abiding love of choir and sherry, or so she presumed. So Natalie takes off. She gets in her car, drives off to the BC Institute of Technology, BCIT, a building, their aerospace building, which she considers to be kind of an unofficial workplace for herself. BCIT was not her alma mater. That was SAIT in Calgary, which had generously overlooked her math and physics grades and welcomed her into the Aircraft Maintenance Engineering program 17 years ago, when they were bending over backward to recruit women. But BCIT felt familiar just the same. All those AME and other aviation students counting down the months till they could enter the real world of flight, the world she now called her own. Her Transportation Safety Board pass entitled her to free parking. And once inside the high-ceilinged common area, she always found a spot she could make her own. With her Starbucks travel mug, her diminutive frame, and her casual Gap wardrobe, she was all but invisible to the students and instructors who crisscrossed the space. Just another technical geek in their midst. After snagging a bench seat beside the giant bank of windows, Natalie opened her laptop and felt the world fall away. The screen played a slideshow of stills from her latest crash, a Robinson R-22 helicopter that had gone down 3 days earlier, unwitnessed in the Coquihalla Canyon. With it went a newly married couple en route home to Vancouver after a week's honeymoon in Kelowna. The husband, a wealthy 64-year-old who'd been flying since his 20s, owner of a gated 1-acre compound on the West Vancouver mountainside. The wife, a 28-year-old personal trainer whom he'd met in Hawaii and whom he'd married, Natalie would bet, as soon as he'd tucked his dick back in his pants and had the prenup drafted, reviewed, inked, and notarized. Not that the courtship timeline was part of the evidence gathered so far. So Natalie proceeds to look at pictures on her laptop and other documents, trying to figure out what happened with this helicopter going down. She's interrupted by Jake, who is someone she has not laid eyes on since she was a student at SAIT in Calgary. He's a very hunky guy. She's surprised to see him and quite pleased, actually. They have a lot of banter and no small amount of flirtation. And then he leaves. So we're going to join Natalie again just afterwards. Willing her hormones to subside, Natalie opened her laptop and wrenched her attention back to the R-22 photos. She clicked on an image of James Stanhope. Like Jake, a rugged Eddie Bauer type, virile and carefree. Yet one morning, his new bride by his side, something went horribly wrong. An error or a misjudgment or a moment of bad luck that in an eye blink rubbed out his joyous future. What happened to you? Natalie silently asked James Stanhope, zooming in on his confident profile. What chain of events lined up to snuff out your life, poof, like that? And where was the pathologist's report that the coroner had promised? She rechecked her email, but found nothing. Just a long-winded invitation, first in French and then in English, to a potluck lunch in Ottawa. Sure, it's only 5,000 kilometers away. I'll be right over. And a terse one-liner from Tucker asking why she wasn't at the training. Her phone rang. Display showed it was Tucker, not the first time her prescient manager had called while she was reading an email from him. She debated letting it go to voicemail, then thought again. Better catch the shit straight on. Hey, she answered, sorry I skipped out on training, but I've got so much to do on this R-22 crash with the media and Natalie. No, really, I'll get one of the guys to fill me in on what I missed. I promise. I'll read the manual or the slides or whatever got handed out. I'll take a test after if you want. Natalie, stop. Listen to me. Tucker paused. Great. What else could she be in trouble for? He cleared his throat. There's been another crash. We just got word. It happened an hour ago, that forest fire near Quesnel. An air tanker went down, a tracker. You need me to go? With her free hand, she shut the laptop and set it on the table in front of her. I can be ready in an hour. My gear's all... Natalie, no. He paused. It's Rafe. Her elbow jerked, and the travel mug spilled the last of its contents onto the table, spattering droplets onto her laptop. She watched the mess spread, unable to move. Tucker spoke. He's dead. So the premise of Uncontrolled Flight is, there's not a big spoiler there, it begins with the death of Rafe. That happens, in fact, earlier in the book, in the prologue, Rafe being an aerial firefighter. And the novel is about how that crash and Rafe's death and the investigation into the crash affect Natalie, the air accident investigator, Will, who's a young pilot who watches his mentor crash before his very eyes at the beginning. And the third character is Sharon, who's the widow of the deceased pilot, who's mired in grief, really, is having trouble moving on.
Yeah, so that's a good intro, and a good intro to Scott as well, who is, comes from that world of aircraft investigating. So I guess first off, Scott, I'm going to ask you. So you read the book. How accurate a portrayal of, aircraft accident investigation, apart from, some of the personal connections, I think, I'm not going to get into it too much, but like, is this how these sorts of investigations are done? And like, how many of them do you have to do a year too? I was curious about that.
That's that's a lot of a line of questioning. So we'll start with the book itself. So yes, I did spend part of my summer reading it, and I'm extraordinarily grateful for the opportunity to do so, because it was an extraordinarily compelling story. The story itself. Just by the end of the prologue, it had touched me deeply. Whether fortunately or unfortunately, it was with great sadness. So it really does speak to the compellingness of it. Um, but the reason why it touched me so greatly is because it really does place you in the shoes of somebody recounting the unimaginable. I use that word very specifically, unimaginable, and it's because of the profoundness of the situation that I've spent the vast majority of my adult life admiring airplanes, generally for their beauty. Uh, but these are just machines, but they're machines that can sometimes and somehow look like they're going fast, even if they're just sitting still. And many pilots are like this, in fact. However, we also appreciate, even cherish, these machines for keeping us safe. So to witness one crash, flown by one's best friend nonetheless, is truly unimaginable. So to make things worse, then, and despite the intent of needing to learn safety lessons from it, we then ask people to recount. So throughout safety investigations, we ask people to recount the events over and over again, often in the most minute granularity, forcing them to relive unimaginable events. So yes, the story was indeed deeply moving. Um, Enough so that I had to take quite a few deep breaths, even at the end of the prologue, to keep myself from crying while seated in the back of a flight to Ottawa earlier this summer. So it was a very real story. I know it is fiction, but if it touched me that deeply, then I will tell you that it is absolutely compelling, but amazingly congruent with what accident investigation um, truly is. And that within accident investigation, everybody knows a little of something. So call that context. Everybody knows one little piece, but it's up to the accident investigator to somehow figure it all out, to figure out how it all fits together. So the collage that Frances told the story from within is remarkably congruent with how we try to put the context of these storylines back together to formulate something into an accident investigation. So, with regards to your final part of the question, how many do accident investigators undertake throughout the year? It completely varies from region to region. The content of accident investigation varies greatly from region to region. Sometimes you will be asked to do multitude of smaller accidents, nonetheless, that can be tragic. And sometimes you spend all of your time focused on a single accident. So, as Francis tells in the story, we have Natalie who is congruently working or concurrently working on multiple investigations. And she could have been placed on this one as well, but for factors that the book gets into, she was not placed on it. And sometimes you do have to, or accident investigators will have to parse out um, to take bits and pieces of investigations at a time and then move on to the next and come back to it. So it is an extraordinarily difficult profession. Um, and it's an extraordinarily difficult job to put together all of these little bits and pieces of context. Um, and it's those pieces of context that I want to come back to that make this so compelling as to the depth of the sadness that we actually see in and within many of the characters. So I hope that fully answers your question, Matt.
It's a good time too for me to jump in, probably to let people know that I'm married to somebody like Scott, an accident investigator. He's recently retired from the field, but that's what gave me insight into the work that you did for some time yourself, Scott. And a lot of the things that you're talking about, what accident investigators have to go through, talking to witnesses again and again, and talking to people who've been part of an accident. And it's it might be of interest to people to know that one of the things that made me write this novel was that Travis, my husband, was telling me about an accident. It was not an accident that this novel is based on, but it was an accident. And he had to interview earlier that day a young pilot who had watched a crash, who had seen a crash happen in front of him. And this pilot was, like a fairly tough guy, sort of macho guy and everything. And Travis was telling me what it was like to have interviewed him. And he started off kind of taciturn, not saying too much, but as they got into it, just like you were saying, and he had to relive what he went through and what he saw, things got really real really fast. And that stayed with Travis, and Travis was telling me about that over dinner that night, and it stayed with me. It really, really stayed with me. What would that be like to see that happen before your very eyes, and how would that affect you? So that was definitely one of the kernels of the novel right there.
And it really, that story transcends the fictitious story that you do tell. That each of these people have something to say. They want to tell their story, no matter how difficult it is. But it is the accident investigator that really needs to draw these minute details out of them, and it's extraordinarily challenging for that to happen. Compounding why it is so challenging, but also the profound sadness that's expressed throughout the novel, um, is the attribute of blame that introduces into this. So throughout accident investigations, there's there's any number of people that can be connected with these occurrences, and they sometimes, and more than others, more times than others, will actually blame themselves, or a small portion will blame themselves, and they do so because they only know a small portion of the complete context as it relates to them. So they say, I could have done something, I could have said something. And these are all very normal feelings. Unfortunately, they're all very counterfactual because we have no idea if that would have actually changed the trajectory of reality. But unfortunately, this tendency to blame is the opposite methodology to what's used in accident investigation, that of which is never to determine blame, but rather enable that retelling, that really profoundly sad retelling sometimes, of what we can learn to know, to get that entirety of the context from the people. So without surviving pilots, without recorded data, without voice recordings, all of which are included in this novel, um, all of those things place those individual pieces of knowledge and data into the context that a safety investigator needs, and it's extraordinarily challenging to do that. And the outcome of the safety investigation tries to, or it attempts to make sense of what happens from the
Hmm.
perspective of the people at the pointy end of that, uh, of the airplane or helicopter. And that's a interesting way to put it in those relative terms, because that's what an investigation is. It's sense making. It is trying to describe why everything made sense to that person right up until the minute that it didn't, within the entire backdrop of people trying to blame themselves or thinking that they could have done something differently.
Mhm.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
seems like a pretty small community, right? Like it's for aviation enthusiasts and aviation detectives, essentially. Like everyone probably knows each other, right?
So
Especially in the firefighting community, for instance, where this is placed, like everyone is going to want to think of the best of the pilot who passed away. They're not going to want to assign blame like, oh, he was drunk or whatever. Like everyone wants to be friends with everyone in this smaller community, right? Can you guys talk a little bit about that? Because I have to assume that the people in the hobby aviation slash any community like that, that's a pretty select few, right?
it certainly is. We talk about aviation being a really small community. It's thousands of people. It's tens of thousands of people. But those people are connected by very few linkages, or very few degrees of separation. And when you look at the granularity to which you're talking about, that even within the firefighting community, you can go one step further within the British Columbia firefighting community, that level of separation becomes even smaller, into which it is truly a profession where everybody knows somebody that's been touched by uh, incidents or accidents, and everybody does in this novel. It really does illustrate how close and connected the industry is.
Mm. Yeah, and in the novel too, Rafe, the pilot who dies at the beginning, you really learn that he's built a reputation in that small community of not just BC aerial firefighters, but the larger aerial firefighting community, even in Canada, because he's flown in Ontario as well. And he's known as this fearless, very accurate pilot who's always reliable, good at what he does, and so on. So when he dies, the impact not just on Will, the young pilot who sees it, and on the others who who are part of his immediate life, but the impact on the larger firefighting community is kind of felt as well. You're aware that it does touch everybody, and yet, as you learn when you read the novel, Rafe has gone out of his way to keep a low profile in society at large, like outside that tight community of aerial firefighters. And there are reasons for that to do with his past. Yeah, but it's an interesting community to delve into. You know, something else that prompted me to write this novel was that back in my freelance career, I was doing some writing for the Canadian Forest Service, and I actually dug up, this is kind of interesting, a bit of show and tell here. This is the novel. I actually dug up this edition of the State of Canada's Forests from 2003, 2004. And I got hired to write a feature piece for this government report about forests about the 2003 Kelowna fire, the fire that required mass evacuations of the city of Kelowna. It started in Okanagan Mountain Park and then spread from there. And that was probably the first really, really huge, serious, high-profile forest fire in British Columbia in quite a long time that happened in what they call an interface area, like an area between the the wilderness and where people actually live. And so for the piece, I was asked to go and interview a bunch of people who were affected by that fire. So some of them were people who'd lost property or almost lost it, emergency management people who were kind of directing the response to the fire. But I did talk to a number of firefighters as well. And that just stayed with me, just that whole experience of talking to people who'd been through such a traumatic experience, such a conflagration that went on and was so frightening. And the people who were at the front line fighting it, who let's face it, I mean, we saw so much of that this very summer, right? All across Canada. These people who wake up in the morning and just put themselves out there, right in front of burning flame, or over top of it in the case of the aerial firefighters. And they know the risks of what they're doing. They know that they're putting their lives in danger, and they go and they do it day after day. And I mean, I still can't fathom how that happens. I know at least one aerial firefighter is here on this for this launch today. And I think a lot of us are really struck by people like that who decide that they're going to abandon the notion of having control over everything. They're going to throw themselves out there anyway, and they're going to do what they have to do. And that's a lot what my book is about. That title, Uncontrolled Flight, it works on a number of levels. It's about the uncontrolled flight into terrain of the airplane, but it's also just about what happens when we relinquish control. Do we relinquish it? Can we relinquish it? And what about the people who just kind of say to hell with control and they just run at the thing like a fire?
Yeah, I was going to ask because we have a fairly successful line of mystery series here at the press. Writing style wise, was there an attempt to make this an investigation story apart from Natalie? Like, obviously Natalie's investigating the crash, but I find that Will is investigating his own interactions with Rafe and his own actions that day, whereas Sharon is examining her whole life with Rafe, being married for many years. So they're all kind of detectives in their way. So I wanted to ask, like, writing style, did you look at detective fiction at all? Are there any detective authors you like? And do you think of this as being kind of a detective story? If not, I will retract the question.
Oh, it's a very fair question, I would say. Scott, I think you were kind of touching on this with what you were saying before, that obviously, because I was writing about accident investigation, and that's something that my husband did. And I should add, by the way, as a freelance writer, I didn't just write, articles for the Canadian Forest Service. I spent a very long time writing investigation reports, mainly investigations into complaints of harassment in the workplace, a theme that comes up in the novel. And so I have had a long history of writing investigative reports and basically sifting through facts that you've gathered by interviewing witnesses and looking at documents and doing all that stuff, and analyzing those facts and coming up with conclusions. And I have no doubt that the novel is very much influenced by that. So by the structure of an investigation report, which is very similar to the structure of a detective novel. And I've always read in that genre. I mean, I read super widely, but, like give me a Tana French novel, for example. She's so wonderful because she can unfold a mystery while also delving into really strong and interesting and complex characters. And that's for detective fiction, whether it's her or Barbara Vine is another favorite of mine. That's Ruth Rendell, when she used to write under the pseudonym of Barbara Vine when she was writing more psychological crime. And I really like detective stories when there's a strong psychological element and a character element.
Yeah, Tana French especially is one of my favorites too. And I think if you're more of a literary person who doesn't delve into detective fiction, I would say that Tana French's dialogue, especially in kind of the scenes where cops try to break down a suspect, is probably some of the most psychologically dense and like well well established and well crafted ways of the way just people talk to each other, especially in a very stressful situation like this. It's a really good way for more literary types to learn, maybe a bit more engaging dialogue, I'd say. But you also share that sort of sense yourself, Frances, with your two books and people being put in horrible situations. It feels very realistic as to how they speak to one another. I guess I'll talk to both of you about this next one here, though. So we were talking a lot about the trauma that the families of people who die in these crashes go through, because it seems usually like it's going to end up in death. Like it's kind of hard to avoid when you're flying up in the air. But is there talk in the industry of how the investigators and firefighters, how does everyone deal with the trauma of their jobs? Essentially, seeing people die is traumatic, and I would have to assume that for firefighters especially, seeing just the size and scale of these fires and how much they destroy, that has to take a toll on it. But Frances, with your family connections, and Scott, with your being in the industry, do you want to talk a little bit about how trauma is, don't want to say dealt with, but how it's kind of addressed in these sort of situations?
Yeah. Well, Scott, I mean, it'll be good to hear from you being actually in the field. I mean, my experience of the trauma that's dealt with by first responders, to use a big, general category, comes from a lot of sitting in my office where I am right now, and sure, talking to people and reading and doing research, which is by no means at all the same thing as living through it. So I'm very well aware of the fact that I'm at a remove. My dad was an RCMP officer, and he was one who did not speak of what he saw until really quite late in his life. And, when I think of my husband, having seen lots of dead bodies and some members of his family, paramedic, RCMP, and so on, I think I get the sense anyway, that people in those fields respond to trauma in very different ways. But especially, I think, when they're, maybe I don't want to be sexist about it, but I think especially when they're men, and I think especially if they're in a field where they're called upon to be very strong and reliable and macho and all those traits that we, historically associate with masculinity, I mean, for good or for ill. If they feel that that's who they are, it can be very hard to admit to being pummeled by trauma or grief, or just to even admit that it affects you. It's like this crack in the veneer of strength or something. So it's hopefully that's changing a little bit, but I get the sense that there's still a certain amount of deflecting the real talk about it. I don't know, what do you think, Scott?
You're absolutely correct. But part of what I'll highlight is the generational divide that we're starting to now see. In If we draw the linkage between, say, your father's generation and the one now, the stiff upper lip is finally starting to crack. The pilot industry, aviation industry in general, let's face it, it is still a very male-dominated industry. When we get to it, it's getting better, but statistically, it still very much is. When we get to forest firefighting, even more so. Um, for years, it was very much the thought of holding it within, that you have to withstand, that the image of a pilot or the image of somebody on the front lines with a forest fire, or maybe a fire in general, is that you do have to be in control, and that person is looked upon for that characteristic. It's not to say that it's still not the case, but at least now we're talking about it. That certain industries have come a lot further and maybe faster, but the aviation industry is certainly catching up, and maybe we are there. Um, but what I can recount is very recently, I sat in on a training program with a group of aerial forest firefighters. And one of the absolutely remarkable expressions that was discussed in it was with one member who had recently witnessed a aircraft accident. Um, there was thankfully no death involved, but just seeing an aircraft accident and knowing how catastrophic to the lives of the people around it that it can be does take a toll on somebody's emotions, somebody's confidence, and it does create, well, it can create a moral injury. The really remarkable part of the session that I was a part of, that I was privileged even to witness, was that the openness was an incredible about face from what we have seen when I started in the industry 20 years ago. The stiff upper lip may still be there, but people talk openly about how these things touch them and share their experiences uh, far more openly now than I thought was capable within this industry. But I was uh, remarkably grateful to hear how it has transitioned that way. And that exists as well within accident investigators. People in that field, and as Matt alluded to before, there's a very few air accident investigators within this country. They all relate to these occurrences quite differently. And the trauma involved at that level is very different than the trauma involved from somebody in industry witnessing something, or being a part of something. Because with an air accident investigator, that trauma stays with them throughout. Well, it can stay with them throughout the length of the investigation. And more to what Matt said earlier, that how many are you involved with? Well, you're involved with sometimes multiple per year, but some of those very complex ones can extend for years of data gathering and writing, and you're constantly reliving that trauma. But the people involved then see the accident investigator as the conduit to their loved one. And they will sometimes keep coming back to that person, thus not not specifically re-injuring, but potentially re-injuring and uh, exemplifying the moral injury that can exist within accident investigators.
It's
That's
really,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, it's good to hear that you're seeing a little more openness of expression. I mean, that's really, really heartening to hear. I've been struck through my research, and just again from individuals that I've known who've been in areas of emergency management and first response, at the tight bonds that form between the people who work together, like among firefighters as an example. And you see it in air accident investigation too. You go through such difficult experiences together, and there's a bond. There's a really strong bond that's created. And that was something else I really wanted to explore with the book, it struck me as something that maybe didn't get, at least when I was drafting the book, which admittedly was 10 years ago now when I began it. It struck me as something that didn't get a lot of airtime in fiction, I guess particularly literary fiction. The bond that's created, especially between men, especially in these kind of macho fields where maybe there's not a natural inclination to talk about feelings. And yet the friendships, the partnerships that develop go so deep sometimes. It's really quite something. I mean, we've got our movies about, cops who are partners and stuff like that. I guess that does get covered in movies to a certain extent, but it was something that I wanted to have a look at in a more character-based way, because it's really, those are partnerships and those are friendships that are lifelong in many cases. And so when one of them is cut short, as happens in the novel with Rafe going down and Will witnessing it, that is such a break in Will's life. It's something that's very, very hard for him to move beyond.
Yeah, it also seems like it's not like you can. Oh,
and
sorry, go ahead.
And within the industry, Frances, you're very right to say how deeply this touched Will in the book, because there are numerous stories of pilots across Canada who maybe not witnessed, but were part of the system which lost friends or which lost colleagues that they had worked with, and some never make it back to an industry that they absolutely love because they just can't bring themselves to do it anymore.
Yeah, it seems like something that you can't really relate to a lot of other people if your job is to, bomb water on forest fires. It's not exactly something that most people have experience of. I'm going to remind everyone to check out the link from Western Sky Books in our chat. And if you have any questions for Scott and Frances, please type them in there. But I've got a few notes here that I can pass along. Nancy Hack says that this is her book club's next book for October. They really like the Broken Places, and they're hoping to read this one next. So great, thank you, Nancy. Margie, another one of our authors, says she wants to know if the crash in the book is based on a real event at all. So I'll pass it on to you two.
It is a little bit, like I was saying before, that idea that there was that real life instance of my husband having interviewed a young pilot who'd seen a pilot that he considered to be his mentor crash. He witnessed that crash, so that part was real. And and there have been some crashes of air tankers while fighting fires over the years. I mean, this very season is one example of that. But I did not base the crash in this novel on a specific crash that happened. I mean, I did a lot of research to try to make the crash as realistic as possible and the conditions and the aftermath of it, the investigation, without borrowing facts from any real crash. So it's representative of the kind of crash that certainly could happen and does happen in real life without being just a slightly fictionalized example of something factual.
Okay, cool. So I've got a few more notes in the chat here. If you've got questions, please put them in there and I'll read them out and pose them to Frances and Scott. Ray says, congratulations, Frances. I'm 32 chapters in and already having trouble putting it down. As a past air tanker pilot and having been far too intimately involved in the loss of more than one coworker and friend over the years and the resulting TSB investigations, I can say unequivocally, you nailed it. Your novel has brought back many of the emotions and fragilities I myself felt at the time. Not only a truly compelling story, but coming from a typically perfectionist pilot, a book that is also technically correct. Thank you for the recognition you brought to our niche industry. So cool. Thanks, Ray.
Well, it's a good time, by the way, Matt, for us to thank Ray, because Ray has no small part in the technical accuracy when it comes to the aerial firefighting. He was one of my go-to people for researching that side.
Cool. Thank you, Ray. JG Chaco chimes in with, I love Tana French as well. Gorgeous writing. Yeah, great pick for ours. Carol says she really enjoyed the presentation, hopes to get a copy of the book. So thank you, Carol. Frances says this sounds fascinating. Margie says this sounds fascinating. Frances, I'll be getting the book ASAP. Glenna says, how did you deal with the trauma yourself about having to write about this? That's a good question. Do authors need to have sort of therapy sessions as well when dreaming up these scenarios?
That's a good question. So I think, I mean, I didn't experience trauma from researching the novel per se, but I'll tell you what, I'm very aware of the fact that one of the things that motivated me to write the book was fear of trauma that I might experience. So my husband, besides being a retired accident investigator, is a private pilot, and he has been his whole life since he was a teenager. And I go up flying with him, but he often goes up flying on his own. And when you live with somebody who flies an aircraft, you have to recognize the inherent danger involved in that. And I don't think I'm overstating it to say that every time he goes up, or every time that we go up, I'm aware, there's a little part of me that is aware, what if this is the time that we don't come home, you know? Or if I'm home, what if this is the day that I get the phone call saying he's not coming back, you know? And it's a possibility, and it's I don't know, it's not something that I can really do justice to, I don't think, in a short time, but it's something, well, I'd say buy the book, because there's a lot about this in the book, I suppose, that I guess you have to accept that fear. You have to accept that the fear is there, and it's one of the things that maybe gives life a keen edge. It makes our experiences keen, and it deepens them in a strange way. I think maybe when we allow ourselves to do things that are risky, or we allow our loved ones, or we accept that our loved ones are going to do things that are risky. So I don't know, I guess all to say, it's always in the back of my mind that I could turn into the widow of a pilot. I don't want to, because I love my husband dearly. And I did have to deal with some of those feelings while writing the book, especially when writing about Sharon, the widow of Rafe. I put myself in her shoes, and I thought, what if I was the one who lost the pilot?
Sure, that makes sense. We got a question here from Richard. Richard asks, I'm a big Frances Peck fan who happens to live in Tucson, Arizona. I love the broken places. The fact that it was set in Vancouver did not diminish my enjoyment. Oh, it's good to know. My question, is there any aspect of Uncontrolled Flight that is uniquely Canadian? Could the story have been set in the USA with changed organization names? It sounds like it deals with universal human themes, but I wonder how you see it. Are there any themes or characteristics that are particularly Canadian? Maybe the federal government stuff? I don't know how they handle the plane crashes down south, but you two are more equipped to talk about that one.
Scott, what do you think about that?
So there's absolutely elements that will transcend the 49th parallel, but there's absolutely elements that will not. The methodology for accident investigation within Canada is a similar methodology, but the rules surrounding dealing with the data from within the accident investigation is vastly different. That the rules set up within this country protects the privacy of the people most intimately connected with the investigation, that their recounting of accidents or incidents or any events are protected um, inherently, to give them um, the understanding or the trust in the system that they can be completely open. Uh, So accident investigations within this country or very rarely involve the lawyers. On the American side of things, they have very competent accident investigators there too. However, the data that is collected becomes, or at least a lot of it becomes very public and very quickly within the investigation, it can become public. This is not to say that people are less inclined to be honest or open, but within the Canadian system, people are provided that protection. So the accident itself absolutely could happen anywhere. It could happen in the United States. It could happen in Australia. It could happen in continental Europe or throughout the world, really. But as Matt alluded, the federal government aspect of it is uniquely Canadian.
All right, I got a couple last questions here, but Tamara's put in the link for our US participants on the call. The book is available through bookshop.org, which is a great website. Essentially links up small bookstores in the States to a larger sort of internet sales framework, so you don't have to go to a big evil corporation that I don't want to mention. So bookshop.org, great stuff. Second last question I've got here comes from Trish. I think this one's more for Frances. Is writing a 9-to-5 job, or does it overtake your whole day when you're really getting into it?
Gee, there need to be
You're muted there, Frances.
there need to be a few other choices there, I think, because it's neither 9 to 5 nor taking up all my day necessarily. These days, it's sort of like 10 until 1 day a week sort of thing. I'm not doing a lot of active writing right now, but my writing schedule has varied an awful lot through the time that I've been doing it. I've definitely had periods where I've been working on it, never full time, but I would say pretty strong part time, where I'm probably putting in about 50% of a normal working week on doing writing. When it comes to revisions, just because I love to revise, I like that a lot better than writing the first draft. I can very easily spend 8 hours a day, 9 hours a day, sometimes 10 hours a day revising, and I have done that, and I look forward to doing it again when novel number 3 finally gets to the end of the crappy first draft. It's taking a long time. I can't wait to get in there and start fixing it up because I have a lot of time for that. I find that first draft extremely challenging, though, to get out. And it's amazing. That's when you realize that, you have to do things like pull out large appliances and clean underneath them and attack parts of your yard that you haven't visited for 10 years. Suddenly there are weeds that need removing from it and stuff like that. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's interesting how productive you get when you have a task like that on the desk. One last question. So Michelle says, this sounds like an amazing story. Since you're speaking a lot about trauma and dark themes, are there content warnings or guidance for the book? I kind of answered this one. We did not put a content warning. We were kind of assuming that the catalog copy would sort of indicate the difficult subject material in the book. But I guess as a general suggestion, Frances, what do you think about maybe putting a content warning on something like this, or your other book, which is about a large earthquake / tsunami? Like, would you want to kind of qualify the book in that sense, or would you want to let people know what's going to happen, or what's your thoughts on that, just quickly?
I do hope that people read descriptions of books before they read them, and I think that's kind of what I prefer, catalog copy or the back jacket copy, to give people an idea. But the other thing is, I want to rush in to say, like, we've been focusing a lot on the dark subject matter of the book today, but it's not all dark. I mean, there is some humor, maybe even in the passage that I read. Like, there's some stuff that's kind of satirical about government, for example, and definitely some of the glimpses of society in and around Vancouver and some of the interactions between the characters and so on. It's not all dark. And there is ultimately, for sure, hope at the end of the book. But yeah, I little bit, I guess, shy away from the content warnings. Also, because in some cases, if you get really thorough with those, you might end up introducing spoilers, because there's some things that develop in this book that are not alluded to on the jacket, but that's because to allude to them would kind of tell you some of the puzzles and mysteries that get solved through the reading of the book. So I'd say it's an adult book for sure. My mother-in-law is 2/3 of the way through it right now, and she keeps phoning and saying, there are so many swears in it. Why are there so many swears all the time? So there's all kinds of bad language. There's a lot of sex. There's some explicit sex, and there is definitely some trauma. So I'd say if that's not your jam, do not buy this book. But if that intrigues you, give it a shot.
Yeah, it's kind of the whole buffet of human emotions. I mean, when you're dealing with life and death situations like this, you're going to get a lot of different reactions to what happens. Some sexy stuff, some swearing. It's got lots of good stuff. Everyone will enjoy this, I think. Thank you very much, Frances and Scott, for coming out and teaching our attendees a little bit about the backstory of the book and about how crash scene investigations go. Thank you to Western Sky Books for hosting the book on their site, and a great place to buy a copy. Otherwise, check that Canadian Independent Bookstore link to get something in your neck of the woods, and bookshop.org if you're in the States. Yeah, let's just use some of our homegrown stores, let's say, rather than the big evil ones. But yeah, thanks to everyone for coming. Do you want any last words, Frances, Scott?
Sure, I'll give Frances the last one, but it's a deep honor to be given to read the book in advance of its release and to join you today. The last comment that I'd like to make is a generality about the book, about humanity, and about accident investigation. That our world is inherently non-linear. There is very little cause and effect anymore. We see this in almost every attribute of our lives and our dealings, locally, nationally, and internationally. The book itself is profound in how it describes a complex set of interactions, and we would be very well versed in all of our lives to take a step back, to not keep thinking that everything is so cause and effect, that X plus Y does not always equal Z, that it is a group of causation. There is a complex interaction within, and we all need to take a breath and understand that things are complex, and we may not always understand them all, but we can hope that we will get enough context to be able to understand it, enough that it makes sense to us. So it was a deep honor to read this and to be able to share this idea of a nonlinear world, and how wonderful all of these themes through everything that I've done in my professional career has been woven through this book. So thanks to everybody who attended, and again, it was a deep honor.
Wow. And Scott, thank you for attending, but also for summing up the book so well, because, that's ultimately, it's exactly what I was going for. There is a lot of complexity in it. I think things happen that people are not going to like and not going to agree with. But the question is to understand why. And yeah, we live in a time when people want things a little more linear and a little more black and white, and that's just not the way humanity works. So thank you for getting it, Scott. I appreciate that. And Matt and company, thank you for publishing it. And thank you everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So safe drive home. You're already home. It's fine. But thank you for coming out, and please check out the book when you get a second. And yeah, check out newwestpress.com as well. We got lots of other great books there. And yeah, thank you very much. Good night.